Now, for our final public session, session 6, pursuing a new U.S. China policy framework, goals, strategy, and policy prescriptions. Joining us now, Dr. Kurt Campbell, Ambassador Karl Eikenberry on our board, Dave Rank, and also on our board moderating this session is Andy Rothman. Andy.
Thank you, Margaret. That was a great discussion with Secretaries Kissinger and Schultz. And as you know, we're on the eve of a new administration, and we're also on the eve of a new chapter in U.S. China relations. So welcome to a discussion about how this chapter might unfold. I'm Andy Rothman. As Margaret said, I'm a board member at the Northern California Asia Society. I'm also an investment strategist at Matthews Asia, the largest Asia-focused active equity investment manager in the U.S. Prior to moving to the Bay Area 7 years ago, I lived and worked in China for more than 20 years, first with the State Department. I started when George Shultz was secretary, and then as a private sector observer of China's economic development. I'd like to now briefly introduce our discussion partners. Kurt Campbell was Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and Pacific Affairs in the Obama administration after serving in senior Asia roles in the Pentagon and the White House. And as I'm sure you know, yesterday, the Biden transition announced that Kurt will return to the White House as the top policy official for Asia in the National Security Council. Karl Eikenberry may be best known for his service in Afghanistan, where he was commander of the U.S.-led coalition forces and then as U.S. ambassador. But many of us on this call know Kurt that during his 35-year career in the U.S. Army, Karl was also a leader in thinking about China, including as the defense attaché in the U.S. Embassy in Beijing. We're also joined by Dave Rank, who was a Foreign Service officer for 27 years, including 6 assignments in Greater China. His last assignment was as Deputy Chief of Mission and then acting ambassador at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing. Dave is also somewhat famous for having started a trend when he was the acting ambassador. In June 2017, he was one of the first senior government officials to resign in protest of President Trump's policies. Dave is now the head of China practice at the Cohen Group. I had the great pleasure of working with Kurt, Karl, and Dave during my Foreign Service career, and now have the honor of moderating today's discussion. So I'd like to start the conversation off with Kurt. And Kurt, to do that, I'd like to introduce to our audience some of the key points that you made in a Foreign Affairs article that was just published a few days ago. So bear with me while I introduce the audience to those points. You noted that some of the troubling behavior in China could present problems for the region's long peace. You pointed out South China Sea island building, East China Sea incursions, conflict with India, threats to invade Taiwan, internal repression in Hong Kong and Xinjiang. But you also pointed out that what you described as marginal buy-in from China has played a central role in the region's success thus far, and it will remain important in the years ahead. And you wrote that Washington will have to work with others to strengthen the system, provide Beijing with incentives to engage productively, and then collectively design penalties if China decides to take the steps that threaten the larger order. And this all, I think, is consistent with something that you wrote a couple of years ago in another Foreign Affairs article, where you pointed out that despite the many divides between the two countries, the US and China, each will need to be prepared to live with the other as a major power. The starting point for the right US approach must be humility about the capacity of decisions made in Washington to determine the direction of long-term developments in Beijing. So that sounds like quite a different approach to thinking about not only US-China relations, but China's role in the world. And I also thought it was interesting that it seems to be, to me, consistent with what Bill Burns, who's the Biden nominee to be the director of the CIA, said in an interview just a few days ago. He said, it's not as if we have the capacity to block China's rise, but we certainly have the capacity to shape the environment into which China rises. And he went on to say, we can affect the incentives and disincentives of a Chinese leadership, similar to the points that you made. So with that introduction to what you've been writing recently, Kurt, do you want to expand on that a little bit about how you think those principles, that philosophy will play out in the coming years?
Andy, thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you. And I must say, I'm sure I'm like everyone else when you turn on the Zoom and you're confronted by two of the giants in American foreign policy. It's a little daunting to think that you're coming next, but I'm comforted, frankly, being on a panel with one of my oldest, dearest friends, Karl Eikenberry. Frankly, no one has helped, at least me as a person just making his way as a person in the Pentagon now 25 years ago. No one helped me more than Karl, and I agree with you. I think his career will be remembered more than anything else for what he did in terms of helping us all think about China. So I would say about the piece, I hope you'll allow me, Andy, the model for the piece that I just did in Foreign Affairs was actually around a book that Dr. Kissinger wrote many, many years ago. It's actually his first book called A World Restored. And it was about the experiment that two great diplomats, Kasserich and Metternich, did to try to build the great long peace of Europe around legitimacy and balance, and whether those component pieces can be helpful and useful as we think about the Asia-Pacific region in the period ahead. So, look, I like the question very much. My only reframing of it, and I'm thrilled that Bill is going to be the CIA director. There's no better diplomat on the planet, and he'll be an outstanding CIA director. I think we probably have to adjust a little bit our language. We talk a lot about China's rise as if it's something that's either ongoing or that will happen into the future, in which that has already happened. I would probably make the argument that the country that is really shaping the Asia-Pacific region right now, more than any other, is China. And I think the biggest question is really not whether China and how China will rise, but whether the United States is going to continue to play the role that it has played historically. And I think that's the biggest question, if I may say, Andy. And so I just want, friends are actually watching this in other parts of the United States. I just want to remind people that today, as we speak, most of our capital is boarded up. There's more barbed wire, more fences, and actually more troops in Washington, D.C. currently than there is in Afghanistan, American troops. And so as we approach this period ahead, I think we have to do it with just a remarkable sense of humility and recognize some of the domestic challenges that we're facing. Vice President Biden, President-elect Biden, just put out today his game plan for the coronavirus and how to think about the economic plan going forward. So all I would say is the most important ingredient and probably the most challenging ingredient in affecting a viable, balanced strategy between the United States and China is our own success. And so there have been many times in the past where there have been concerns about American decline during Vietnam, when Dr. Kissinger was National Security Advisor, and during periods where Secretary Shultz had to, summon American purpose in times of distress. Many in the region are questioning our own ability to play that traditional role of supporting what I described as the operating system of Asia, a system which has led to the greatest period of prosperity in global history. And it has been not only good for the United States and the countries of Asia, but good for China. And so the key is, can that system be adapted and adopted in ways that still get buy-in from both countries? Now, I fundamentally believe, and I'll just conclude with this, that it is possible to present to China options for working together with the international community in ways that will be of benefit to all involved, and to also present clear steps that China will face if they take steps that continue along a path that are paths that are of concern, deep concern, to countries and others in the region as a whole. And the key ingredient of that is not just partnerships and bringing in Europe, but really the role of the United States. And so the time ahead will really, as much not just assembling this coalition, working together on trade and technology and joint military and strategic issues. The most important thing is to make clear to Asian countries that rumors of our demise are misguided, and that we're going to continue to play a vibrant, dominant, engaging role in the Asia-Pacific region. And that's going to be hard. It's going to require, again, a humility, strategy, diplomacy, every tool in our tool kit going forward. And it will probably take more than just one administration. Andy, that's a long answer to a very good short question, but it gives us a sense, I think, of what the stakes are and what the challenges ahead are.
Thanks, Kurt. That's a terrific start to the conversation. So I'd like to ask both Karl and Dave to share their thoughts on that. Maybe Karl, you can go first, particularly about the idea that Kurt mentioned about providing incentives for China to change its behavior, maybe move more towards global norms.
I think first, let me return, Kurt, your compliments. My time in the Pentagon, those 3 years working for you, were extraordinarily instructive. You lifted me from the tactical level, so to speak, to the strategic level. Andy, I think that maybe I could contribute most at this point in the conversation, talking about some of the challenges that the United States military, that our armed forces are facing as we're thinking about China. And perhaps that can get to this topic then of how will that in turn shape China's thinking. Let me touch upon two challenges then that I think that the Biden administration faces, and I'll speak narrowly first about as I said, the military, knowing that our military response, something that David and Kurt will have a lot more to say about, and I can contribute to as well when we talk about partners and alliances. The first is that the Pentagon is starting to go through a major change in its doctrine. Whether or not it's moving fast enough is debatable, but our military, after having spent 15 to 20 years focused on counterterrorism and wars of insurgency in the Middle East, is shifting now to thinking more and focusing more and prioritizing a great power competition, in particular China and Russia. And this is a profound shift that they're having to make. So the emphasis right now that you're seeing from our armed forces is improving doctrine, thinking about connectivity, resilience, and redundancy of our command and control systems, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, and strike systems. We're seeing more emphasis now on the deployment of long-range precision strike weapons, a more asymmetrical approach to the challenge that China poses in the Asia-Pacific region. More talk about the dispersion of forces into eliminating single points of vulnerability, and to improved access for U.S. military forces in the Indo-Pacific region. Those require diplomatic task in order to accomplish. The second challenge that the Biden administration will face is in fiscal constraints. Our federal debt exceeds right now 100% of our GDP. That's historically a high. We're expecting it to be 106% of GDP by the year 2023. This is not sustainable. And so then the Pentagon is faced with this major problem in that the National Defense Strategy, which had generally a bipartisan support under Secretary Mattis of 2018, you'll recall that the assumption was that the defense spending would increase by 3 to 5% every year going forward. And there was an increase in 2019, but now the projections are it's going to flatline or perhaps diminish. And when you have 50% of the federal budget's discretionary spending is by the Pentagon, you've got this massive pressure right now on the budget. It's hard to imagine that defense spending is not going to be under attack. And as we look at U.S. national security strategy, I think there's moving in a direction now where we're defining our strategy and defense in more of a whole of nation approach, and one in which we consider the resilience of our infrastructure, in which we consider the infrastructure itself, our healthcare resilience, all of those are considerations now for national defense. So let me close with that when we talk about the military competition, the security competition with China, we're constrained. New thinking and new tactics and doctrine are called for. And we have a final challenge is we like to think back to the Cold War days about how we developed a strategy against the Soviet Union. But in that era, there was the nuclear strategy, and then the conventional strategy was actually clearly defined. We knew where the interests were, we knew what the scenarios were. But I submit in the case of China, this is extraordinarily difficult. We talk about a South China Sea scenario. That could be two destroyers having an accident in close maneuver, and then what? Does that lead then to a massive war between China and the United States? We think about Taiwan scenarios. We think about East China Sea scenarios. But if you're a force planner and thinking through those scenarios, you don't come up with easy answers then. You don't come up with easy resolutions about what kind of force structure do you need to deal with these problems. So it goes far beyond military, and it gets into the question of economic competition, technological competition, and the battle for allies and influence around the world.
Thanks, Karl. I certainly want to come back to you and talk a little bit more about the risks of operational miscalculations and accidents and what that might present if it were to happen. But first, Dave, would love to hear your comments on what we've talked about so far.
Sure. Let me pick up a little bit on what Kurt, you were talking about on the idea of the need to be humble, humility in foreign policy, because I think it will be, it's always been important. I think it will be particularly important, Karl, what you were talking about in an era of limited resources. And I think anytime you talk about the kind of competition that we face with China, it's always going to be an era of limited resources, right? That it will be an extraordinarily expensive in one form of capital or another endeavor. You think we need to be clear-eyed about the nature of the Chinese regime, that we have serious differences, serious issues with how China organizes itself and the structure of the regime. But I think we have to be humble about our ability to affect it. And, in an era of limited resources, and this gets back to something, Kurt, you said, the place where I think the country over which we have the most influence is the United States. And that seems to me where you have to first focus your efforts, as we look to how do we deal with the challenge China presents. And I guess my last point would be, there's the old saw of, presidents look to foreign policy because it's relatively easy, easier than domestic policy. You don't have to sort of get down into the muck. I hope that doesn't end up the temptation of the Biden administration, because there is just so much that needs to be done here domestically. And as both of you said, it has such a direct impact on what our foreign policy will look like and the success of it.
Thanks. I'd like to bring into the conversation a couple of points that Secretary Shultz made just a few minutes ago. He repeatedly emphasized the idea about trust, and even talked about how with an adversary, it was really important to go out of his way to develop a personal degree of trust so that even the toughest issues could be discussed. And obviously, the absence of trust or even mistrust is a big problem between the U.S. and China. The last time I was able to go to Beijing before COVID, I sat with one of my longtime Chinese government contacts who pulled his cell phone out of his pocket and waved it around and said, "I don't even know who to call in Washington anymore. There's no one to talk to." I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on how the Biden administration might overcome these problems. Maybe start with you, Kurt.
Yeah, Andy, it's a great question. I personally believe that the most important quality in U.S.-China relationship, it rests on a couple of things: predictability, steadiness, and clarity. It would be my own view that we have to be careful not to overplay the concept of trust, like the kind of trust that I think George Shultz has written about in his wonderful piece about the 10 lessons from his career. I recall, I will just say one thing, Andy, like you, I've had a little bit of experience in the region. I worked, and I won't go into specifics, but I have a diplomat in Beijing who I would consider a very close friend. And I've worked with him for now almost 30 years. And we've been to a number of rodeos together, a lot of challenges. And during one of the most heated and challenging periods, when we were interacting about the status and the stakes around a dissident who had found his way into the American embassy. And we were figuring out what to do, both to honor his wishes and also do what we could to preserve the quality of the U.S. China relationship, which at that period was also facing enormous challenges. And I can remember in a very tense period in our negotiations, he asked me, he said, I need you to clarify for me that this is not all part of a giant plan on the part of the United States. And I do wonder, Andy, and you probably would be better placed to answer that question. My sense is that among most Chinese interlocutors, for a range of reasons, both experience and propaganda and a whole host of things, I think the level of distrust is so profound that it's very difficult to imagine climbing that mountain. But my suggestion would be to think differently, which is how do you construct and develop a relationship that is workable with the realization that the abiding belief and undermining sentiment is largely distrust. And I think with that is a recognition you have to take small steps. You can't be so ambitious that you'll fail. Very regular communication. Statements of strategic purpose, no surprises, and a very clear interaction when you believe that either understandings or issues have been handled in an appropriate way. So that's probably, and I'm sorry if that sounds really pessimistic. It's not meant to be. It's really meant to be deal with the world in which we're living, as opposed to a set of circumstances that I think will be, at least in the short term or even the medium term, extraordinarily hard to achieve.
Those are great comments. I would just add that I'm more optimistic or less pessimistic, and that might be because over the years, the majority of my interactions with people in China, including Chinese officials, have been on the economic side. Yeah. And even back when Dave and I were working in the embassy together, and he was focused more on political issues and myself on economic issues, it was almost like we were in different countries in terms of the way the relationship went. But that the fact that we can find ways to trust each other and have discussions, even where we disagree on those issues, leads me to be more hopeful that if we find a different way to approach the more complicated political issues, that we can rebuild some of that trust. But maybe let me turn that over to Dave to see what he wants to add to that.
I was going to jump in to add a note of pessimism to your sunny optimism, Andy, that we don't even agree on the nature of trust, right? As you noted in your introduction, I served 4 assignments on the mainland, and the refrain from Chinese officials is we have to build trust and then we can get things done. And of course, from the U.S. perspective, it was exactly the opposite. The way you build trust is by getting things done. And so I still think just that fundamental disagreement on the nature of trust and what it means in the relationship is still there. But Kurt, what you said about having some basic principles about how you operate, One of the things that I mean, lots of things have broken down in the last 4 years in the relationship, but I think one of the big ones that undermines sort of the working level operational trust is that the doctrine of no surprises has fallen by the wayside. That if you are the senior director for Asia sitting in Washington, I think probably every morning you wake up with a surprise on your desk coming out of Beijing, and Beijing feels the same way with the surprise they get from Washington, and that's a real problem. Just sort of the day-to-day, how do you organize a relationship when you don't know what's coming down the pike?
Karl, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah. So I know this will resonate with you, Andy, and David and Kurt, but you talk about this effort to build trust between the two sides. From the days that I was in the Pentagon until today, for instance, as we talk about Pentagon and military dialogue with the Chinese military, I think what the experience has been is that on the Chinese side, we've got a very different kind of leadership. It's a collective leadership. And so we talk about building trust with individuals, and perhaps that can be done at the presidential level, but you don't go too far down into the Chinese bureaucracy until when you get to the point that it is a collective leadership. And no one person wants to really raise their hand and take charge and make decisions. I think this is very problematic, and it's become more so under Xi Jinping with a very top-down driven system. A second challenge that we've got is the asymmetry between organizations, very dissimilar in many instances. So if we talk about a military dialogue, perhaps Indo-Pacific Command, which then looks at the Indo-Pacific area and assumes that it should have certain military responsibilities. There really is no direct Chinese counterpart to that. On a prescription I would give is that when we talk about this building of trust at the very senior levels and in the most visible positions of government and the military, I think it's also important to remember that 24/7, we've got an embassy in Beijing, and 24/7, the Chinese have an embassy here in Washington, D.C. And the ability then, at least on our side of Washington, D.C., to empower that embassy, make sure it's staffed with the right kind of people, and then try to work through them. And that's the only way you're going to empower them. And those can have very productive outcomes then when you've got a steady state team on the ground that builds counterpart relationships. You can get insights and things done that aren't going to appear in the Washington Post within 5 minutes of the decision.
Great. Those are terrific comments. And Kurt, could I ask you to maybe give us a sense of how you think this might work in a process sense? And you're somebody who, one of the great benefits of you taking this job is you've got a lot of experience and knowledge and understanding of what's worked and what hasn't worked in terms of the process of engagement between the two sides. So how do you restart things after the problems of the last 4 years? We hear that a senior Chinese official, Yang Jiechi, wants to come to Washington, but we also know that the Biden administration wants to coordinate with other democracies around the world in terms of how to deal with China. How do we get off the ball here? Is it going to be something that's going to happen in a few weeks, or are we going to have to wait many months to figure out where the relationship gets restarted and how?
And you'll excuse, I mean, there are some of these issues that, as you can imagine, are still being worked out. It would be hard to describe how transitions are enormously difficult in the best of circumstances, right? But imagine, again, horribly divided. I just, if you don't mind, I just want to provide our viewers a sense of what it's like. I was at the OEOB the other day, and just imagine a situation, almost a huge number of people have cleared out, have left, have either resigned or have gone back to their agencies. So it's almost vacant.
That's the old executive office building next to the White House for those who are not Washington.
I apologize, Andy. Thank you. Exactly that. Many of the people on the Trump team are not as interested, shall we say, in a smooth transition and are more inclined to make it more difficult. There are a few that are trying, but there's a lot of surprises, a lot of things out the door that feel more like booby traps than, welcome packages, right? So there's that. In addition, you've got about 1,000 new people that are theoretically coming into the old executive office building and the White House compound, that, whatever 13, 15 acre plot. None of those people yet, a small group, have been vaccinated. There's some question about how that's going to happen. I think the supplies that theoretically have been set aside for this incoming team don't appear to be available. So just huge numbers of questions. So you've got to begin with that. And the metaphor to have in your mind, I'm a person who loves movies, and there's a wonderful scene in The Godfather where Michael goes to the hospital and he's been badly injured, and he walks in and the Godfather's completely unguarded, right? And it's a sense of tremendous vulnerability. There is a little bit of that feeling right now, right? And that's just the case. And so I think a degree of patience as we get off the dime, with the recognition, a huge initial focus on some domestic issues. I do believe there will be some allied engagement, but I also am of the view that there has to be some communications at the outset with Chinese interlocutors and friends. And I would say that there are a couple of things that are going to be necessary. The first is settling on the appropriate kinds of channels and the mechanisms of engagement. And I think we've tried very small, of the kind that Dr. Kissinger did, kind of very high level White House kinds of engagement. And we tried very large, the strategic and economic dialogue. And I think both have their limitations. And I think we're going to have to think carefully about a mechanism which involves the key institutions, probably at the White House, certainly the State Department, and because of the points that Karl, Dave, and you have made, Andy, on the economic team, and figure out how to do that with not a massive coterie of people involved. The second thing, I would say that the proposition has to go something like this, in which you underscore to Chinese interlocutors and friends that if this continues on this current course, then we're going to descend into a terrible place, a horrible, in some respects worse than the Cold War, and more damaging economically because of the interdependence that currently exists. And even though each side tends to think it will hurt the other more, it would hurt both of us and the surrounding region and the planet substantially. And so it's probably wise and opportune for both sides to stop, take a deep breath, perhaps step back a little bit, reflect, and then think about small steps that either side, both sides, can take to signal a desire to at least have a workable relationship in the period ahead. And I think that would be the way forward. And these should be steps that are achievable. We can't say we'd like you to change your whole system, right? And they can't say, to us, withdraw your forces from Asia. Those are not viable steps, but there may be things on visas, on journalists, on consular outposts. There are a number of things that you could imagine that could be potentially helpful along this path. Let me just stop with one thing though on that, Andy, that I just want to underscore. I do believe that is the right way, but I also believe that there is somewhat of a debate in Beijing right now. And I believe that there is a group of people that think this is the time to try to establish a better working relationship with the United States. I think there's probably some indications, another group that is arguing that, look, this is clear. The United States is in the midst of decline and we can press our advantages. And so how we orchestrate that opening, we have to do it in such a way from a position that they and the region and we know that we're going to continue to play an important role, and that such an entree not be perceived as a sign of weakness. My own view, and I say this carefully, I've never worked with a group of people that are so attuned to the correlation of forces. And so how we handle those initial interactions are going to be of absolutely critical importance. The last couple of weeks, raises some concerns. The crackdown in Hong Kong, further steps in Xinjiang, and also what we've seen across the Taiwan Straits, really strong economic coercion against Australia, plus a very substantial, some would say that this is a good sign, but a clear desire to split the United States from Europe. Those are important steps. We have to sort of recognize them in our calculations as we go forward and understand that the Chinese are playing a form of hardball. And so Andy, those are all the things that we have to think about as we go forward. I still believe, however, that there are some modest steps that could be taken that could at least take us away from this kind of dissent, which I do believe would be profoundly, deeply troubling for all concerned.
Thanks, Kurt. And when you talk about modest steps, if I could raise a couple of examples and get your thoughts on that. One is the Trump administration's been firing off and continues to fire off today a series of executive orders related to China, a few of which have already come into effect as of Monday. There are bans on investing in a handful of Chinese companies, but a lot of these other executive orders will not come into effect until after the Biden administration is in office, which, if they were not paused, would kind of allow the Trump administration to govern from beyond the grave. So I'd love to hear what you think about what might happen to those executive orders. And then there's also the question of the tariffs, where it's really clear that this has inflicted almost no pain at all on China, hasn't resulted in any changes of behavior, but has inflicted significant pain on American consumers and American workers as part of a misguided effort to focus on the bilateral trade deficit. Could we see something done there as part of an idea of building back better the American economy and moving to a different way of incentivizing China to behave better?
Yeah, look, Andy, I think you have very accurately laid out some of the options and some of the challenges. I would simply say that what the Trump administration has done across the board on Cuba, on domestic issues associated with pollution requirements, with drilling, with Iran, just go down. These are, frankly, the kinds of steps that have never, we've seen occasional things, but this really is an attempt not just to govern beyond the grave. Because remember, this is not, some of these issues, if they thought they were so good, why didn't they do them 6 months ago or a year ago? But doing them with 4 or 5 or 6 days left really suggests they're done not as part of trying to ensure a legacy, but really meant to stick it to the Biden administration. So I think those are things that people are looking at carefully. I would also say that there are a few things that have been put on the table that I think a degree of respect and engagement with Taiwan makes sense. But the way it's been done, it's politicized. It's meant as a weapon, almost used against the Biden administration in a way that really makes bipartisan conduct of foreign policy that much more difficult.
Karl, I think you were looking to jump into this.
Yeah, I was, and really great observations by Kurt. We're lucky to have him join the administration. Really, 2 more questions for Kurt. First, Kurt, there's been this notion that President Biden has really got to focus on America, and he's going to be inward looking. True. But at the same time, he's bringing in one of the most experienced foreign policy teams that we've got on record. It's an amazing group. They're known globally. They're known in the Asia Pacific region. President-elect Biden, he has a pretty clear vision of how he thinks about the world, how he thinks about allies and partners, how he thinks about democracy. So true, maybe his bandwidth the first year will not have a lot to attend to foreign affairs, but it seems that the team he's got comes in with the experience and gravitas that we can actually walk and chew gum at the same time here. The second is that we've talked about the Trump administration, the mess that's getting left behind. When we talk about China, we also have to think about the United States Congress. And a lot of the Trump actions that were taken that we talk about, they're grounded in congressional law. Seems like a huge bipartisan consensus on the challenges posed by China. So is this going to pose dilemmas for those in the administration that would be arguing for, say, a harder line on China than we saw maybe during the first term of the Obama administration?
I could just jump in on this. So look, I think what Karl raises extraordinarily important points. I will say this, though, guys, Andy, just to remember, I would say there has been greater strategic change in the last 4 years in regional dynamics, in perception of the United States, than probably at any other time since the United States really emerged as a major power after the Second World War. And it's going to be hugely important to recognize what some of those changes are. And so rather than just start right off the bat and say, look, here are all the things that we're going to do, I do believe a degree of, and it's certainly not a skill normally of America, let's do some listening and consultation. So I don't mind saying, in the last week, I've spent most of my life in the last 30 years in Asia, but I've had more different kinds of conversations in the last week. And Andy, I'll tell you, I've learned stuff that has really surprised me. And I'm trying to be honest. I have found countries that have normally always been worried that the United States is going to stray towards a harder line, really saying stuff has changed. You've got to be much more vigilant now. So I'll say that. So I think thinking along those lines is going to be critical. But the other thing that Karl talked about, which I think is probably the most important thing, I do agree there is some bipartisan consensus. But the real challenge with Asia policy and China policy is that it's kind of a mile wide and not even an inch deep. And so you say to people, you say, well, what's our China strategy? Well, we've got to be tougher. We've got to be tougher. We got to stand at Chinese adventurism. Well, tell me about technology. Well, we got to think that through. Well, tell me specifically about AI, about 5G, about robotics, about human sciences, about quantum computing. Exactly what would you have us do? I don't know, but a handful of people, and certainly none that are sort of in the strategic community, that can give you the kind of answers that you're going to need going forward. And our challenge, it's not dissimilar to an early period in the Cold War, in which most of the people that thought about what at that time was the coin of the realm, throwaways, military capabilities, only a small group of military people or former military people understood those issues. And it took about a generation for young up-and-coming strategists on think tank scholarships and such, I was one of those people, to learn to understand some of the dimensions of the nature of the competition between the United States and then former Soviet Union or the Soviet Union. The next phase of the competition, in all likelihood, will be played out mostly in these technological realms. And that is going to require not simple, kind of crude tools of the kind that we've used more recently, but much more nuanced, that don't completely savage global supply chains and create enormous market disruptions. And that's going to be hard, Andy, and it's not going to happen overnight. And so Karl's right to point out that there are things that you can build on, that there's greater interest, greater focus. But I would say more than anything else, we are in a period of capacity building. 10 years ago, when Karl was in Afghanistan and I was working in the Pentagon, we were both, laboring in different, vectors. I was primarily focused on trying to de-emphasize our engagement in the Middle East and South Asia and focus more on Asia and make that transition strategically, educationally, philosophically, and this is much more commonly understood in San Francisco, for instance, than it might be on the East Coast. But that's what we're involved in. and it's going to take time, and it's going to take substantial efforts to recruit new kinds of people into government posts and to be able to tap into that expertise of people that are in various, components of American industry. And so I don't mean to say that this is completely unachievable or beyond the realm of the possible, but I will say that the idea that a new administration is going to settle on a new and completely viable and well-polished strategy for how to engage diplomatically, militarily, and commercially on trade and economics with both parties against trade. At the outset, people aren't paying attention. It's just going to be an enormous task, which leads you to question, why would anyone want this job? Sorry.
We've all been asking.
Well, those are great points about the detail. But to me, listening to all of those difficulties, it just reinforces why I think it's so important that right off the bat, the senior people who the president-elect has already gathered around himself come up with smart and clear objectives for the overall direction of policy and how the U.S. and China will interact with the rest of the world. Do we want to slow down their economic rise and force them to decouple, or do we want them to get richer with the idea that that might make them less repressive at home? Do we want them to be a major part of the world and us with them, or do we want to be the primary operator in Asia, not China? If we have those objectives set at the beginning, then I hope it's much easier to fill in the details below that. But I'd like to pass it over to Dave now and see what he thinks about all this.
Well, I mean, as Kurt, you were talking, the first thing I thought is, yes, I'm really glad it's you and not me. I mean, it's just a huge mess made harder by 4 years of making it worse, right? That we have been, we've spent a lot of time sort of backing out of the region. I was, I'm kind of hearkening back to the earlier conversation. It's in the hat I wear as a consultant, it's been interesting to hear American businesses pining for the S&ED, hearkening back fondly to the days.
Dave, stop yourself. Things can't be getting that bad. I was part of S&ED. I don't know who you're hanging out with. No one's asking for the S&ED. Okay?
No one's asking, but they are looking for the reassurance that we're talking to each other, right?
Just to let the audience know, that's the strategic and economic dialogue between the U.S. and China.
Right, in case they confuse it with the SED, right? But it is just sort of the basic mechanisms of how we talk to each other, I think, are going to be really important. Just figuring out a rhythm of regularly communicating with each other. And I guess we're all very critical of the U.S. and how we sort of have the issues in the trust deficit, and we see our system close up. I will say there's a real problem on the Chinese side too, right? That the lack of trust within the Chinese system is a real problem to dialogue. When it's Andy, you talked about, or maybe it was you, Kurt, talking about being able to have a conversation and knowing it's not going to show up on the Washington Post the next day. I mean, you have a similar dynamic in the Chinese system that Chinese diplomats can't talk to American diplomats alone. They can't have an unguarded conversation and sort of lay out a nuanced view of what Beijing is looking for, because they're afraid that, not that it's going to end up on the People's Daily, but they're going to get ratted out within their system for sort of insufficient loyalty to the talking points as drafted. So it is a real problem on both sides.
Okay, we're down to the last 5 minutes or so of our session, unfortunately. I know I would be delighted to listen to you guys keep talking for much longer than that, but that's all the time we're going to have. So maybe I'd like to ask the three of you for some concluding remarks. And feel free to say anything, but one idea is, what do you think the biggest risks are? what worries you the most about U.S.-China relations over the next couple of years? But feel free to comment on anything in your last remarks. Karl, do you want to go first?
Sure. So maybe three propositions for the Biden administration. The first is the need to align economic, technological competition and security policies. They've been very fragmented under the Trump administration. The second would be to recognize, as we talk about enlisting allies and partners and friends around the world in a more collective multinational approach in our China policy, a starting point is that there's not going to be a set of overarching common interests that make this coherent. There's the possibility with the advanced democracies of the world that we can get understandings about economic exchange with China and rules, or maybe with technological competition. But NATO is not going to be remotely interested in the South China Sea. And the third then is what we've heard from for this past hour is the starting point for all of this has got to be heal thyself. When we talk about a China strategy, it's interesting when you try to think through this, how often you come back to getting our own act in order. And so the awful images that we had last week, it makes it very, very difficult if that were to continue to have anything to stay on the global stage or to China directly about Xinjiang or Hong Kong. Thanks.
Dave?
I mean, there are lots of things that worry me. I guess I would say, as we look at U.S.-China competition, we would conclude that the way, the solution is to be more Chinese than the Chinese are, to be sort of bigger and better industrial policies, a more autocratic system led by Washington. I mean, I think the solution really is to be better Americans, to look at what got us to where we are and double down on those. Our democratic values, the free market that has led us to where we are today, and then to look at what China has done well and not reject it, but sort of selectively identify the things, that emphasizing infrastructure, investing in people, those sorts of things that a smart country, whether it is a communist autocratic country or the United States, ought to be doing. And that's my hope, is that we will turn to that.
Yeah, along those lines, it really pains me when I hear people say, well, the Chinese system is so great because it's a top-down economic model and we should maybe adjust ours and follow that, without realizing that all the new job creation in China, all the wealth creation in China is coming from entrepreneurial small companies. They're actually following our model on the economic side of the house for the most part. Kurt, you get the last several minutes.
So, look, I agree with Karl. I like both Karl and Dave's points, and I also agree with Dave. There's a lot of things to worry about. I do think that getting your house in order, I do worry about the challenges that we're facing in the United States. And I worry about the next little while. And, we all have things that we're reading about. I'm trying to read about what happens when you have a substantially supercharged nationalist minority in your country. How do you deal with that? How is that solved? How is that healed? And the historical lessons are tough, and they're not great. And, they're, some involve dying off, some involve education, some economic, changes, but very challenging just across the board. The other thing, this may surprise folks. I wouldn't surprise. I mean, I would say it also concerns me. I worry that the United States and China really are not as seized with the immediacy of the challenge provided by climate change. I think all the evidence suggests this is happening much more rapidly, with much potentially more destabilizing consequences than anyone really understands. And if this continues without really direct action of not only the United States and China, but other emerging states like India and Indonesia, and really most of Asia, the world that we're contemplating is so very different than the world we've enjoyed. And we will leave a destroyed ecosystem with billions on the move in migration and really destabilizing consequences. And so I know it's not usual in strategic discourse to enter that as the prime issue to worry about, but I think that's wrong. I think this is should be in many respects the driving feature. The key is not to do it in such a way that China says, God, we'd love to work with you on this, but you're going to have to make other adjustments in your foreign policy or domestic policy. That's not right. This is a existential challenge to both countries and to the globe, and we have a mutual interest. This is not a topic of negotiation and maneuver. It's a matter of urgency.
Thank you, Kurt. That's great. And thank you for mentioning education. I'm hoping that one of the early things the Biden administration can do is reverse what I think are some of the own goals from the Trump administration related to education, restart the Peace Corps program in China, resume the Fulbright programs on the mainland in Hong Kong, and return to encouraging students from China, from India, from everywhere to coming and studying in the United States. But we're out of time. So I really want to express my personal gratitude and appreciation, as well as that from the Asia Society, Kurt Campbell, Dave Rank, Karl Eikenberry, for a fantastic discussion. If you enjoyed this discussion, I'd like to encourage you to think about joining the Northern California Center of the Asia Society. You can see the website address up on your screen, and you can just Google Northern California Asia Society. We'd love to have you as a member. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Margaret Connolly, our Executive Director.
Thank you, Andy. What a terrific way to end the day. We hope we've helped navigate some understanding between the U.S.-China relationship. We know we have a lot more work to do, so please check out our website for more programs. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. Congratulations again to Secretary George Shultz. This concludes the public portion of our program. For those joining our closing VIP reception, please click over to the second link that was emailed to you earlier today. A big thank you to our speakers, our sponsors, our board, our volunteers, our interns, and especially to our team. This team has worked incredibly hard to pull this 8 hours of live programming off with 28 speakers. Pilar Jumpsit, Rexel Uy, James Gale, and Michael Chung, thank you. And on behalf of the Northern California Center, stay safe.